Hello YouTube. Tamriel is full of interesting and terrifying fantasy creatures, and I've talked about many of them on this channel in the past, covering their stories and lore in detail. And in this long lore collection video I have compiled many of the most interesting creatures that I've talked about in the past into one long lore video for you to enjoy with timestamped chapters in case you want to skip a certain creature or skip this intro. Because there's one last thing before we begin. There are so many interesting creatures on Tamriel that I've already made an almost 2-hour long lore compilation on interesting creatures that I published last year. But like I said there are many more interesting creatures on Tamriel than I just presented there, and probably even more than I presented here. So this video is filled with an all new different set of creatures, meaning that if you are in the mood for learning about even more creatures after this video, Volume 1 contains 2 more hours of even more creature lore. Alright, so now let's talk about some interesting creatures, starting with the mighty sea serpents. So, sea serpents, gigantic snake-like creatures which roam the deep seas around Tamriel. These creatures are gigantic and are dangerous, with some of them, according to the Elder Scrolls Redguard, being over 20 meters long, or that's 64 feet for the Yanks out there. They have extremely hard scales that almost nothing can pierce. The poison in their sharp, sometimes 3 feet long teeth is extremely deadly, and almost no one to see one on the high seas is likely to live to tell the tale. To many people on Tamriel, especially those living more inland, they are popular creatures for folk tales, scary creatures that old fishermen scare the children of the village with. But they are very real. They seem to be native to the oceans south and west of Tamriel, where wild variants presumably live close to the ocean floor. However, we best know them as the war beasts and mounts of the Marmer, or the Sea Elves, who are the race of elves that are native to the continent of Piennene, which lies far to the south of Tamriel. They are led by their king Orgnum, a legendary immortal elf who had allegedly been there since the very earliest days of the elves, on their legendary homeland of Aldmuris. Now, King Orgnum is a topic for a video all on itself, but according to the lore that we have, he is some kind of wizard king who allegedly uses dark magic and rituals involving sacrifices to extend his own life, but whether that's true is to be determined by future lore. What's important, however, is that Orgnum is said to have been the first one to actually tame one of the mighty sea serpents that he found in the deep seas around Piennene, and then use it for a war mount, riding it into war at the head of his sea elf fleets. It's said that he tamed the sea serpents using a special kind of snake magic ritual, which brings these beasts under the Marmer's control. Now, ever since the domination of the very first sea serpent, they have been the backbone of the Marmer navy in their eternal battles against the Somerset Isles and the High Elves. Some Marmer, like their king, mount the sea serpents into battle, while other, even larger sea serpents accompany the Marmer fleets on their voyage under the water, ready to surface at a moment's notice and crush the High Elves when the captains of the fleet command it. It's said that the Marmer breed ever larger sea serpents, with some of them being so big that they can snap a High Elf ship in two by simply curling their massive bodies around the ship. A Marmer invasion or a ship battle on the high seas almost always involves a sea serpent, which they try to leverage in the most advantageous way possible to crush their High Elf enemies. It is said that even some regular Marmer pirates, or rather privateers as they are pirating in the service of their king, sometimes bring a sea serpent, making Marmer privateers one of the most dangerous kinds of pirates that you can encounter on the high seas around Tamriel. While the Marmer breed a lot of sea predators, such as flying sea vipers, for war, the sea serpent is by far the largest and the most deadly and the most important one. It's an iconic animal to the Marmer, appearing in all their iconography, from their flags to their weapons to their tattoos to their ships to their helmets, and even to their cutlery, with many ornate Marmer forks seemingly having a sea serpent for a fork head, according to some item descriptions. Now, the sea serpent is described as sacred to the Marmer, which is not a surprise after hearing, that it's basically in everything for them. Seemingly, the animal also serves some kind of religious purpose to their culture, although we know very little about their religion. What we do know, however, is that the hard scales and supple skin of sea serpents makes for very sturdy material that the Marmer use to make armor out of, and they use the long teeth of the sea serpents to make weaponry. And not just that, as the Marmer also use sea serpents to breed with elves, with Marmer. Well, likely not in the way that you're thinking. You see, the Sea Elves have these Leviathans, which are skilled Sea Elves with lower intelligence than regular Sea Elves, but they have more muscles and they have higher primal aggression, requiring other Sea Elves to keep them in check on the battlefield and just, in society. Tamriel scholars have discovered that these Leviathans are likely the results of Marmor crossing with sea serpents. While the idea is quite disturbing, it's likely that it isn't breeding in the literal sense. You see, King Orknum seems to like his dark rituals and experiments, so it's, I think at least, far more likely that these Leviathans are the result of regular Marmor babies having been involved in some kind of magical ritual which fused them with some sea serpent genes or whatever. Because it's far more likely, in my opinion, that they are, a result of a ritual than these humanoids doing the nasties with a really big snake. But, that's just my interpretation of things. Now, another piece of speculation on the sea serpents is on how exactly the rituals which bring them under Marmor control work. Because we don't know how they work. Because one source that we have implies that it's just King Orknum's magical rituals which allow all Marmor to control the serpents. The way that the source is written makes me think that Orknum himself may be the only one who's able to do it, and thus that he is the one who dominates the minds of all the sea serpents under the Marmor control, all at one point in himself. Meaning that if you as a Marmor serpent rider disobey Orknum, he might just send your own serpent upon you. However, that's only one implication of the wording. One can also interpret the text as Orknum having invented the rituals to control the serpents and then teaching it to his underlings. Which one it is, we can't really say for certain, but considering that we see some traitors to the Marmor King in the Elder Scrolls Online and they don't seem to have their own sea serpents with them, that does kinda imply that it may be just Orknum all by himself who holds all the serpents under control at once and, just allows some limited control over them by the riders, while keeping the ritual secret to his subjects and keeping the full control with himself. But that's just my own theory, especially since there are some suggestions made that the ancient Yokudans, the far ancestors of the Redguards from since before they migrated to Tamriel from their ancient home of Yokuda, they might have had sea serpents of their own, but that might just be, unreliable sources. But if that is true, that would make it far more unlikely that Orknum is just the only one capable of doing it, but I suppose that we won't know the answer anytime soon until we have new lore on this kind of subject. And that is about all I can say about sea serpents. Now, next up I'll be talking about a fan favorite creature and many people's favorite way of transportation in the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, the Silt Strider. Probably one of Tamriel's most recognizable insects. They are large insects with 6 long legs that look absolutely terrifying if you don't know what they are. No, really, while they are relatively common in Morrowind, which is where they are even used as transportation by the people of Morrowind, people from outside Morrowind in the lore are really scared of these creatures and sometimes don't even dare to ride on them, even though in Morrowind they are basically one of the easiest and most accessible forms of transportation. Fortunately for the people outside of Morrowind, these creatures, despite looking absolutely terrifying, are quite calm and friendly creatures and don't mean the people of Tamriel any harm. And as such they have become a bit of a fan favorite creature, especially for Morrowind players. Even the smallest of Silt Striders, from the tip of their legs to the tops of their carapaces, are at least 6 meters tall, or about 20 feet, with a lot of them growing even taller. The creatures use their long legs to move gracefully across the ash-covered landscapes of Vvardenfell and some parts of Morrowind's mainland. They have thick, durable carapaces, and while moving across the ash landscape, they are far faster than horses, since the horses usually get stuck in the ash. When they are used as beasts of transportation, or Vvardenfell taxis as the community sometimes calls them, a section of their sturdy carapace is carved out to form a seating area, being able to house several travelers. To control the Silt Strider, a driver uses strange and somewhat brutal sounding techniques, as the driver manipulates the Silt Strider's organs with a series of hooks. It really sounds kinda painful for the creature, but it seems like the Silt Striders don't really mind it, although as you'll see further up in this video when we talk about the Nix Ox, this might not be as innocent of a process as we think, but from what we know, the Silt Striders don't really seem to mind. Now, despite their massive sizes, these creatures are highly adaptable to the hostile environments of Morrowind, with their strong shells offering protection against ash storms and predators, and as such very few creatures are willing to challenge a Silt Strider in the wild, knowing that their tough carapaces make them nearly impossible to prey on. If threatened, however, they can become quite dangerous and unpredictable, but that does seem to be quite rare. The Silt Striders start their lives as small larvae, The Silt Strider larvae eventually cocoon themselves before emerging into their final form, after which they grow into their towering adult form. Beyond that, we don't really know much about their life cycle, except that their mating behavior is said to be quite awkward, with clumsy flailing movements that can be dangerous for bystanders. And they may have a sort of in-between form between their larval form and their final form, which is called the Silt Hopper, essentially a small Silt Strider that are used as pack animals in Morrowind. We don't exactly know whether or not these creatures are or are not young Silt Striders. As was pointed out to me, they may simply be a miniature subspecies of Silt Strider instead of a young variant. So while they may represent a stage in a not yet fully grown Silt Strider's life, they may also be their own smaller subspecies. Me personally, I think it's more likely that they are young Silt Striders, somewhere between larva and their final form. That's not really based on anything, but that's the kind of vibe that they give off to me. But that comes from me, a guy whose speculations have often been wrong in the past, so take that with a grain of salt. Now, even though the Silt Striders can survive even the hardest conditions in Vvardenfell, they also have their limits. While immune to ash storms, they are quite vulnerable to lava, and after the eruption of the Red Mountain, which caused the Red Year in Morrowind, many of them got killed by the eruption, and Vvardenfell likely became unlivable for them as their natural environment radically changed, and their food sources likely dwindled and dwindled even further. By the 4th era, during the time of Skyrim, only a few Silt Striders remain. Their numbers are so low now that they are nearly extinct, leaving behind only a distant memory of the time when they roamed Vvardenfell in abundance. However, there is some hope for them, as dialogue in Skyrim does suggest that in the lore there are far more of them left than we actually see in the games. So while they may never be as abundant as they were in the 3rd era ever again, there's still hope for them as a species. And that was the story of the Silt Strider. And for the next creature, we will be staying in the alien land of Morrowind, as we will talk about another fan-favorite family of creatures, the Kwama Family. The Kwama are large insectoid creatures native to Morrowind and northern Blackmarsh. They are primarily kept by the Dunmer, who raise them in caves known as Kwama mines. These mines are valuable for the production of Kwama eggs, a nutritious food source, and Kwama meat, both of which are export products for Morrowind. In fact, Kwama mines make up quite a sizable portion of Morrowind's economy, and running a Kwama mine requires considerable skill and organization, as the mines need to be protected from outside interference, and the egg harvesting needs to be done in such a way that the colony inside the mine continues to thrive. In fact, there's a whole Kwama Council of Morrowind, which acts as a sort of guild for Morrowind's Kwama mine operations. It's big and serious business in Morrowind. Now, in the wild and in the mines, Kwama live in a large structured colony, situated in expansive tunnel networks, which they themselves digged. Within these colonies, there's a clear hierarchy that determines the role of the different Kwama types. On top, we have the Kwama Queen, which is the largest and most vital member of the colony. She produces the eggs that sustain the colony's population, and is the most respected member of the colony. However, due to her massive size, she is immobile and generally relies on those lower in the hierarchy to care for her. The queen is difficult to replace, making her one of the most important individuals in the colony, and sometimes a queen dying may mean the end for a Kwama colony altogether, as it may fall apart. So generally, those colonies living in Kwama mines, the colony exploiters who run the mine, really want to keep the queens alive. Now, below the queen in the hierarchy are the Kwama warriors. They are the protectors of the colony, guarding the tunnels from intruders. These aggressive creatures can deliver both poisonous and elemental attacks, and the larger warriors also mate with the queen to ensure the continuation of the colony and, make sure that egg production happens. Now, below the Kwama warriors are the Kwama workers. They're responsible for digging the tunnels that make up the colony's home, and these workers also produce unique pheromones which allow the Kwama to recognize their own territory. Kwama colonies are known to be very territorial, and encounters with other colonies, for example when two colonies dig into each other's tunnels, can often lead to fights, and usually one of the two colonies being driven to extinction because one of the two colonies wins. Which likely also means that the winning colony probably takes the tunnels of the other colony and expands its own colony into the tunnels. Whether or not that happens, we don't know, but it seems logical to me. Anyway, below the workers in the hierarchy and significantly smaller than the workers are the Kwama foragers. The foragers venture above ground out of the colony to search for food and scout new areas for potential expansions of the colony. Though they are aggressive to travelers, they pose little real threat unless provoked. I'll be honest with you, I always found them to be quite annoying while playing Morrowind, but I know that other people quite enjoy them, so I won't bash them too much, but they are little shitworms. Sorry. Anyway, at the very bottom of the hierarchy are the scribs. Scribs are the larval form of the Kwama emerging from their eggs, and they are generally quite harmless and not aggressive, although they do possess the ability to paralyze their prey if threatened. Eventually these also grow out to all different other types of Kwama, from queens to foragers. Something funny is that there's actually Dunmer children's stories featuring a character called the Brave Little Scrib, which is pretty interesting. I talk about that in my video on the fairy tales and folk tales of Tamriel, which is in the description of the video in case you want to see that after this video. Anyway, the intricate hierarchy and division of labor inside a Kwama colony makes Kwama colonies quite efficient and allows them to thrive beneath Morrowind's ash-filled landscapes. Alright, now having talked about the Kwama, let's skip to a very obscure creature that almost nobody tends to know about, but is very much present in the lore, the Changelings or Shapeshifters. So, Changelings or Shapeshifters. They are formless creatures which can transform into almost any type of living creature, including the playable races of Tamriel. While Changelings aren't truly immortal, they are ageless, with some of them, if not all of them, being born alongside the mortal plane before the very first mortal creatures walked the land, and on modern day Tamriel they are extremely rare. While historians and scholars from institutions such as the Mages Guild are aware of the existence of Changelings, they are only encountered once every few hundred years or so, and even then their contact with the outside world is often fleeting. Now, a quick side note to this is that after doing my research I saw on the UESP that apparently a scrapped concept during the Elder Scrolls Online's development was that Changelings were simply living normal lives alongside Tamriel's population, who were all unaware that they are Changelings. While it's a cut concept and I couldn't find the primary source it came from, it does mean that it's possible that there are many more Changelings around Tamriel than we know, and they just hide it very, very well. And there's a good reason for them to hide it, and for them to only open themselves either to those that they trust, or to only live openly as a changeling in very remote places. Because in some places they are, or at least they were, hunted. You see, the only known tale which tells us of the origin of changelings is the Bosmer or Wood Elf creation myth. While it's not an absolute guarantee that this story is the true origin of changelings, as every creation myth suffers heavily from unreliable narrator problems, it is the only story that we have on changeling origins. Alright, so according to the Bosmer, the world started out as one big formless chaos that has no names, no shapes, no purpose. It was simply chaos, without a beginning or an end. This chaos the Bosmer called the Ooze. Now this ooze was filled with formless spirits who were in a way all changelings and shapeshifters, as they could be everything and nothing at the same time. Then at some point came Ifre, god of the forest, who sang to the formless ooze, and with this singing began to form things out of chaos. Ifre's songs held stories, and these stories produced everything from animals to trees to rocks to water, all from the formless chaos. Now, the formless spirits of the ooze all enjoyed this new reality, and they constantly shapeshifted across this new world which they called the Green. Ifra, however, was to sing a final song, and with that final song he sang the shapeshifting spirits into a shape, giving them form, mortality, and also giving them a purpose. Because these shapeshifting spirits, now no longer shapeshifting, became the Bosmer or the Wood Elves, and their purpose would be the Green Pact, the holy pact with the god Ifre, which forbids the Bosmer from harming the trees of Valenwood, or any part of the forest actually, and it also forbids shapeshifting. The Wood Elves then lost their shapeshifting abilities, except for during a wild hunt, which is an event of sorts which groups of Bosmer can use in times of true desperation, in which through a ritual they can shapeshift into fearsome creatures of the forest. Now, even though this power is said to be gifted to them by Ifre, the Bosmer do rarely use it, only using it in times of true desperation, because the transformations are said to be irreversible, and as such it's a bit of a taboo subject to openly speak of in Bosmer society. That said, these people who changed during the Wild Hunt are not the changelings that we talk about in this video, because you see some of the formless spirits actually rejected Ifre's final song, rejecting the Green Pact and rejecting a mortal shape form. These formless spirits are said to have been the first Green Pact Oathbreakers, and a civil war broke out as the Bosmer teamed up with Ifre to subdue these rebelling formless spirits. Ifre eventually struck down these spirits with the help of the Bosmer, banishing them to what remained of the Ooze, where they would forever be locked into primordial shapeless chaos, never to escape it to the mortal world, only being able to communicate with the outside world through Bosmer religious rituals, being able to watch the mortal world, but to never return and participate in it. Now, over the millennia, the souls of many Bosmer Greenpact breakers, those who harm the forest or do not adhere to the other Greenpact rules, joined these first Oathbreakers, or Shapeshifters or Changelings, in the Ooze, awaiting the final end in the formless chaos of the Ooze. But not all shape-shifting formless spirits were caught by Ifre and the Bosmer. Some did not fight, but rather fled during this civil war kind of thing where Ifre tried to crusade against all the shapeshifters. And those who did not fight but rather fled, they faded into obscurity over the ages. Some fled to the deepest, most chaotic parts of the forest, where even the Bosmer did not dare tread, and others presumably attempted to simply blend in somewhere else if we are to believe content. Now, these changelings, they do possess great power, as they are primordial spirits who were presumably there during and after creation. They can take any shape they wish, although some sources suggest that shape-shifting is something that they cannot just do at will and it simply happens to them. So they cannot determine their own shape, or when they shift even, unless they are taught by a god like Ifre, since they are, basically, a spirit of chaos. So something like that is not something that they can control. Now, this is something that we know from the character Selene, who is by far the most well-known changeling, who appeared in both the Elder Scrolls 1 Arena and in the Elder Scrolls Online. Fun fact, next to being a creature which was likely there during the period of creation, she is also one of the first characters in the Elder Scrolls series period, being there at the creation of the series, since she features quite extensively in one of the quests of the Elder Scrolls 1 Arena. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, as Selene is definitely a creature who deserves her own video someday, where her story can be told in full. Now, to get back to the point, Selene was one of the spirits who retreated deep into the forest during Ifre's war on changelings and hid herself in a place called Selene's Web. A place so deep in the forest that not even the Bosmer themselves dare to tread there, and those who do are said to never return. Now, the first credited outsider to ever enter these forests of Selene's Web was Vanus Galarian, the founder of the Mages Guild, who in exchange for being allowed to open a guild hall in Eldenroot, was sent to investigate this part of the forest for the Sylvanar, who simply said is one of the leaders of the Bosmer people, as not even he knew what was in this part of the forest. Now, when Vanus Galarian entered the deep forest of Selene's Web, he encountered Selene, then in the form of a massive spider who quickly bound his arms and legs in a spider web. Vanus Galarian was actually quite shocked when she then transformed into a female High Elf, and not just a High Elf, but rather a female version of Vanus Galarian, as Selene had never seen a High Elf before and thus simply changed into a female version of him, since apparently you have to have seen what you want to transform into, if you have control of your transformations, which is quite interesting. Now, she likely did this to put him at ease, not realizing that shapeshifting into a female version of someone themselves unnerves them even more, but unnerved or not, Vanus recognized her to be a changeling as he knew about their existence, and he spoke to her, the first shapeshifter to be encountered by mages in nearly 1,000 years according to him. After convincing her that he meant her no harm, she unbound him, and apparently they spoke for a very long time. From this conversation, Vanus derived that she was an ageless being for which time did not hold much meaning, and that she was taught to control her shapeshifting abilities by a powerful creature that she worships as the god of spiders called Shagrath, who Vanus Galarian speculates to have been some aspect of the Daedric prince Mephala most likely, or another strong primordial spirit that's either now gone or also lives in these remote kind of regions and just has never been encountered by mortals. Now, after their civilized conversation, Vanus proposed to her that he would negotiate on her behalf with the Bosmer, as it turned out that she was the one who was responsible for the Bosmer that never returned from that part of the forest, as she likely saw Bosmer, you know, the people who allied with Ifre against her, entering with weapons, likely to hunt animals for food, but she doesn't know that, as a threat, even if the weapons were used to hunt animals. Her last contact with the Bosmer had been when she was hunted, so she usually just killed or enthralled them out of self-preservation. Now, Vanus, when he returned to the Sylvanar, he revealed the existence of Selene to him, and her wish to be left alone. While at first the Sylvanar was hesitant, considering the changing shape thing goes against the Green Pact, Vanus convinced him and the Green Lady, another leader of the Bosmer, to respect the boundaries of her domain, as it had been so long since Ifre's crusade against the Changelings and so little of them are left, that it would be a shame and also a bit childish to take her down now. Considering that she was likely one of the only remaining creatures to have walked alongside Ifre in better times during creation before their whole schism, and considering the fact that it's been that long, the Sylvanar and the Green Lady relented, and they decided to respect the boundaries of her domain. At the same time, Vanus vowed on the behalf of the Mages Guild that the Mages Guild would also respect the boundaries of her domain, therefore leaving Selene to her domain never to be disturbed. Or so was the plan, because as you'll see in my future video on Selene, power-hungry individuals who learned of her existence would still try to invade her domain in order to try and take some of her primordial power for themselves, giving even more examples of why those few remaining changelings would not wish to be disturbed and likely keep themselves hidden in the deepest parts of the forest. That being said, the changelings, in essence being primordial spirits, not only have the power of shapeshifting, they also have an almost unrivaled knowledge of the mortal plane's workings, and therefore are able to use magical powers which are even beyond the scope of the most accomplished mages, leading to the few changelings that we know of to be very powerful mages using strange and powerful magics when in human or elvish or Argonian or Khajiit form. But that's about all that we know about the changelings. Now, if I have to be honest, changelings have become some of my personal favorite creatures in the Elder Scrolls universe over the course of my research. Now, one of my least favorite creatures that is nonetheless interesting is the creature that we will talk about next, the scourge of any Skyrim player's health bar, the Chaurus. A creature many veteran Skyrim players are likely familiar with. The Chaurus is a large predatory arthropod that lives in the darkest caves of Skyrim and the border regions of the province. These creatures are quite strong and annoying in combat. They are known to players and the very few people on Tamriel who have encountered them for their aggressive nature and quite effective combat abilities, including the production of a potent poison which they can shoot at their enemies from a distance. In addition to these poisonous ranged attacks, Chaurus also possess razor-sharp teeth, making them highly dangerous in close quarters combat as well. Now, we don't know all that much about the origins of the Chaurus, however some have speculated that they might be the result of ancient snow elf experiments to create war beasts. This theory kind of aligns with the fact that the Chaurus have been domesticated by the Falmer, the descendants of the snow elves who keep the creatures in pens to breed them for defense and to use the creatures' chitin to craft durable armor. Now, beyond their utility for the Falmer, the Chaurus also strangely have found a place into Nordic cuisine, with their meat being described as a rare delicacy to some, but considering how dangerous these creatures are and the places that we find them in, I doubt that many Nords would actually know what they taste like, save for adventurers who are forced to eat them when they are stuck in caves or people rich enough to have mercenaries sent into caves to fetch Chaurus meat, because while the Falmer have domesticated them, it doesn't seem like any other race had managed to do so, or perhaps they just never tried. Now, one of the most interesting things about the Chaurus is their life cycle, as its life cycle is kinda weird and has some strange aspects to it. Because they begin their lives as eggs from which they hatch into a small young hatchling Chaurus. They then grow into adult creatures, the adult Chauruses that we find in the caves of Skyrim, but then, upon their death, their story isn't over. You see, the corpse of a dead Chaurus becomes a cocoon of sorts, and inside that cocoon grows the next stage in their life cycle. Because from within the decaying shell of the dead creature, a new form known as the Chaurus Hunter emerges, which is a flying and more dangerous version of the Chaurus and is seemingly their ultimate form. Now, something interesting to note here is that we don't know when exactly the Chaurus lay their eggs. Many believe that the eggs, which are very valuable for alchemists by the way, are produced before the Chaurus dies the first time and enters its cocoon stage, meaning that the reproductive part of their life cycle all takes place before their ultimate hunter form comes into the world. Some of those same people have speculated that the Chaurus Hunter is in fact a sort of undead creature, but I don't know about that. Although I do think it's likely that their reproduction takes place during the regular Chaurus stage and not during the Hunter stage, but we don't exactly know. And that's about all I can say about the Chaurus. Pretty interesting creatures if I say so myself, even though I really just don't like them. Now, next up let's talk about a very interesting type of fly, the Fetcherfly. And trust me, if you think flies are not interesting, you'll soon understand why I put them in an interesting creatures list. Fetcherflies are small fly-like creatures native to Vvardenfell and some parts of elsewhere, with a black body and reddish-orange wings. These fly-like insects generate a small amount of heat in their body, making a single Fetcherfly warm to the touch, but when gathered in swarms they become far more dangerous as the heat that they produce in a swarm becomes far more intense and far more dangerous. A large colony of Fetcherflies can create enough warmth to cause their nests to glow from the heat and permanently emit smoke. While a lone Fetcherfly isn't that much of a threat, their swarms are quite dangerous, and they luckily mostly only attack when they feel threatened and will not pursue anyone if they believe that the danger has passed, usually leaving travelers alone once they created far enough distance between the traveler and the nest that they felt were being threatened. Most Fetcherfly colonies are led by a queen, and that queen has a very interesting ability because the queen has the ability to tap into magma sources, as they're called, and transform their nest into a mighty hive golem. This is honestly really cool, and this ability makes them by far one of my favorite insects on this list. Now, this transformation into a hive golem helps the colony relocate the nest, but it can also be used for combat to defend the colony if the queen feels threatened, and that is really cool. Do you now understand why I put them in an interesting creatures video? Yeah, pretty cool for a bunch of flies. Now, next up, let's talk about an interesting and mysterious type of undead creature, Argonian Bog Blights. Okay, so Bog Blights, or the Dead Not Dead, as called by the Argonians. They're strange masked undead Argonian zombies of the swamps, native to the marshes of Blackmarsh. Usually they can be found in groups in specific sections of the swamp that are said to have strange water. Now, in order to fully understand what these creatures are and how they came about, you need to know a little bit about the Argonian customs around death and funerals. You see, when an Argonian dwelling in Blackmarsh dies, their tribe makes them a wooden funerary mask and then lays their body to rest somewhere in the marshes. But then their body is not left alone. Instead, the body that is laid to rest is impaled with a so-called zulvat, a large, richly decorated grave stake used to impale corpses laid to rest in the marshes. This stake is quite long and is made so that if the corpse gets covered in marsh water, people can still see where a corpse had been laid to rest. And not just that, the Zulvat also functions as a sort of gravestone or memorial monument, because on a Zulvat are rich wood carving decorations that tell the story of the Argonian who was laid to rest. The story on the gravestake, according to the few Argonians who are willing to share information on the subject, is actually quite really comprehensive and does not just tell about the life of the one who was laid to rest, but also about who their friends were, what their goals in life were, and what their fears were. Basically a complete story of the Argonian laid to rest. But the Zulvat is not just a sort of gravestone, it also pins a dead Argonian's corpse to the ground so that if their body gets covered with marsh water, it does not float to the surface, as it's eventually always covered by waters of the marsh. It also makes it so that if the body reanimates as a zombie, because the soul cannot move on or for any other reason, then the body is pinned to the ground and cannot raise, meaning that the zombie cannot roam free and terrorize the local population. The interesting thing is that in some areas of Blackmarsh there seems to be something in the water, at least that's the theory of some of the in-universe people who studied them, which makes it so that there is a really high chance in some places of the marsh for the bodies to get reanimated into zombies, or Bog Blights as some call them. Now, as long as these bodies stay submerged and impaled with the Zulvat, then they are essentially harmless. They can't hurt anyone, and as some sources suggest, they won't even move, and they will act like a completely still corpse as long as they are impaled and submerged in the water. However, some people, for a variety of reasons, sometimes take the Zulvats from the swamps when they see them sticking from the water. For example, curious non-Argonians who want to know what the stakes are, or historians and scholars trying to document Argonian society who take them to study the stories engraved on the Zulvats. What these people don't know, however, is that by taking the Zulvat from one of these submerged bodies, that will awaken these bodies that have become undead. You see, while some bodies will simply float to the surface, lifeless, others will rise and become Bog Blights, or Dead Not Dead as the Argonians call them. These half-rotten corpses then form hideous Argonian zombies, wearing their wooden funeral masks and often with large holes somewhere in their abdomen where the Zulvat used to be. And to quickly talk about those masks, the Argonians actually refuse to share why they laid their dead to rest with a wooden mask, but some on Tamriel speculate that it is so that their former friends are not recognizable if they ever do get reanimated as a Bog Blight or a Dead Not Dead. Now, something that we don't know is whether or not Bog Blights are intelligent enough to realize their own creation process. Because while outsiders pulling the Zulvats sets the Bog Blights free, we don't know whether Bog Blights know how this works and make use of it as well. So simply put, we don't know if Bog Blights pull Zulvats of other corpses so that they can free other Bog Blights. We don't know whether they do that. Now, what's also interesting is that these Bog Blights do still very much seem to need the swamp water, as they need to keep themselves immersed in the water in order to stay undead. Because when they are taken out of the water, a strange chemical process in their reanimated bodies makes it so that their bodies violently explode after a while, and before the explosion they leave a trail of toxic air which can poison those in their path. Which is very weird and interesting, and to me suggests that perhaps the sulfur in the water of the swamps has something to do with their bodies being reanimated, which would be interesting, but unfortunately we simply don't know. Now, to no one's surprise, some have tried to weaponize this process of reanimation of Bog Blights. For example, if you have a place where you are hiding some treasure, or you want a place to be guarded for free, why not pull the Zul'Vats in the area around the place you want guarded from the marshes, and then if you yourself want to enter the guarded area, you simply need to bring rotting meat with a really strong stench, as the Bog Blights seem to only be interested in the actually living, and will stay away from those smelling like death, which is interesting. Now, I personally find these creatures to be quite interesting as far as undead go, with the whole story and ritual around them. They are just far more than some generic swamp zombie, and I like it. Especially their design, as you can really see in their design how they were created, you know, with the whole stake being pulled out of their bodies. I don't know, it's a bit weird, but I like it. Alright, now with the story of Bog Blights behind us, there's one creature that has very little lore that I would still very much like to share with you, because it's among my personal favorites. The Ithguleor, a mythical sea leviathan reportedly living in the deep seas north of High Rock and Skyrim. It is apparently a massive and immortal creature prowling the deepest parts of the northern seas. When it comes close to Tamriel's coasts, its movements in the water are cause for massive waves and changes in the coastlines due to it moving the sand with its massive body. The creature is said to have an oily skin, and a terrible smell follows it whenever it comes up to the surface of the water, and that smell is described as a demonic stench. Now, it apparently preys on lost ships, and while raiding parties have gone out to the north to try and hunt the creature, they rarely returned, and always they either failed or they were eaten by this leviathan of the seas. But the great mystery is, what is this creature? What's its origin? What species is the Ithguleor? Are there multiple, or is there just one? I mean, some have taken its immortality to mean that it may be a creature which came to be at the very creation of the world. Back from even before the Elnofae Wars, which were wars between the Elnofaes, which were basically the far ancestors of the mortals on Tamriel. It's a bit complicated, but irrelevant for this to know. Now, these wars shattered Nirn, which first was one big continent, but was then shattered into continents such as Tamriel. These theories about the Ithguleor claim that the Ithguleor is some sort of ancient primordial spirit of sorts, perhaps even an Aedric spirit, so one of the spirits which helped create the mortal plane, which then transformed itself into a leviathan and has then prowled those seas of Nirn ever since the beginning of time. Now, others have speculated that the Ithguleor may have been created inside Oblivion, making it a sort of gigantic Dremora. Now, we know that large creatures have been created in Oblivion before, and they were sent to Tamriel during multiple Oblivion invasions, and this massive creature may be a leftover from one of those invasions from Oblivion, making it a Daedric creature in origin. But whatever the actual answer is, I personally lean more towards the Daedric side if I have to choose between one of these two theories. It's unknown to us, and the true nature of the Ithguleor remains a mystery, and that's why I really hope that we will one day learn more about it than we have now. Anyway, let's talk now about the next creature, a creature that has mystified Skyrim players ever since the release of the Dawnguard DLC. A creature that's in fact so obscure that many people have never even noticed that the DLC added these creatures, the Shellbug. The Shellbug is a pretty mysterious and fascinating creature, primarily known for its hard, durable carapace, which is highly valued by the Falmer for crafting armor. These large insects are bred deep underground by the Falmer for the purpose of harvesting their carapaces. Interestingly, Shellbugs are not aggressive, and they either move very slowly or completely immobile, raising questions about how they might survive in the wild if left on their own. To harvest their tough carapace, a pickaxe or other type of hard equipment is required, as their shell is incredibly sturdy and hard, and when their carapaces are completely mined out, they die. Now, despite this unique piece of lore, we know very little about the Shellbug, and I honestly wish that we knew more about them. If I had to do any speculation, I'd say that they might be related somehow to the Chaurus, but that's just going off their creature design, but we don't really know much more about them in the lore, unfortunately. So that means this is a good time to move on to the next creature, and I'll be honest, it's one of my least favorites, because it's disgusting and unfortunately probably still around in the modern day Tamriel in the 4th era, so there's a good chance that we may see them again in the future. I'm talking of course about the disgusting Hoarvor. The Hoarvor is a creature that I personally find pretty disgusting, and that's why I said they probably still exist, because I kinda hope that they don't, because they're disgusting. They're basically a gigantic variant of the common tick that we have in our own universe, you know, the ones that can give you Lyme disease, those creatures. Now, these creatures are notorious for their blood-drinking tendencies. Hoarvors thrive in damp environments, such as swamps and areas near rivers, where they lurk in search of prey. While they don't typically attack healthy wild creatures, they are opportunistic feeders. They prefer to target the sleeping, injured, dead or dying, and when they gather in large numbers they can overpower large creatures as a pack. The wounds inflicted by Hoarvors are pretty dangerous because when feeding they latch onto arteries, making the removal of the creature a delicate and really dangerous process. If not done carefully, the host could bleed out rapidly, as the Hoarvors bite causes deep wounds that are really difficult to treat. With them being strongly attracted by the scent of blood, Hoarvors can become a serious problem if they are not dealt with quickly. A single dead body left out too long on the streets, or even an unattended pet or livestock creature that is sleeping somewhere, can easily draw an infestation of these disgusting creatures. And once these parasites settle in, they are notoriously difficult to eradicate. However, frost salts are known to deter them from a house, and a mist of viper bite leaves and hazelmoss can also be an effective repellent according to the lore. Now, despite their grotesque nature, Hoarvors are surprisingly edible and are even considered quite tasty by some. The Bosmer, for instance, have been known to keep them as pets and livestock for food and crafting parts, as their skin can be used in crafting quite a lot of different things, especially in Bosmery culture. So they are quite useful, but I'm a bit biased and I kinda hope that we will never see them again, because they are particularly disgusting and they might be my least favorite insect on this list. I don't know why, I just don't like them. You might like them, let me know in the comments if you do, but I don't. So, that having been said, let's skip to a more pleasant creature, the Centaur. And yes, I know that my way of pronouncing Centaur may sound weird to some, but that's unfortunately how it was taught to me as a child, so this accent is never going away. Just know that in the US they pronounce it Centaur. That's just not the way I was taught it. Alright, let's talk about the Centaur. So, the Centaurs. They are creatures that appeared in the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall and later appeared again as a playable card in the Elder Scrolls Legends, while being referenced in the lore in several of the other games. The Centaurs of Tamriel are very much like centaurs in other types of media, a tribal race of horsemen with a lower body of a horse and the torso of a man. They're an intelligent species with just as much, if not more, intelligence than the average mortal. In early concept art from Arena and Daggerfall, they very much look like traditional centaurs from other types of fantasy media. Although in the more recent art from the Elder Scrolls Legends, we can see that their looks have been a bit more refined. They now very much look like a more primitive kind of Bosmer with some orcish features for the torso and hair like traditional Nords, and of course a horse lower body. Their skin also seems to be covered in strange patterns, although those may also be tattoos, which could mean that tattoos may play a bit of a role in their society, but we don't really know anything about that since all we have on their tattoos is this one image. However, both this image and their appearance in Daggerfall and Arena and Daggerfall concept art shows that they are able to use a variety of weapons, from bows to spears to axes. Now, in terms of where they live, they mostly seem to live in Tamriel's forest, with them living in many different places. However, the biggest centaur population seems to be in Valenwood, where at their height several tribes lived a nomadic lifestyle across the Valenwood forests and jungles. According to some legends, they were there, in the forests of Tamriel, since the most ancient times, before the arrival of even the elves on Tamriel, when they came to Tamriel from Old Muris, with the elves likely encountering the centaur tribes in Tamriel's forests after their arrival. Over the years, their numbers have fluctuated a bit, with their tribes being quite numerous in the Merethic and First Era, but their numbers dwindling significantly over the years. Although by the Third Era we know that some tribes, or herds as some in the community call them, still exist. Now, we don't know all too much about their society, but we do know that they have their own quite complex language. They have a complex religion, which seems to be a combination of the Bosmer pantheon, with gods like Ifrez and Auriel and Eos playing a role, while also worshipping their own direct ancestors seemingly. Interestingly enough though, some on Tamriel actually worship them, likely bringing the centaurs offerings and such in their worship, although we don't know exactly how that system of worship works, as we really only know that the centaurs are worshipped by some. Now, we do know that some on Tamriel are actually quite horny for centaurs and see them as a lust object, but I don't think that actually qualifies as worship. But anyway, what we do know is that some on Tamriel think that the centaurs might not really be a mortal species, but rather they might be forest spirits, much like Spriggans are. This might explain why they call the playable races mortals, suggesting that they might not be mortal themselves, which is very interesting and might explain some of the worship that they receive from mortals, as they might have strange magical powers or something like that we don't know much about. As beyond Daggerfall, they have not really been expanded upon all that much. They have been referenced and mentioned multiple times in the lore, but they've never been shown, except for one appearance as a card in the Elder Scrolls Legends. That said, they were supposed to play a far bigger role in both the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim and in the Elder Scrolls Online, as both developer interviews and cut content data mines show us several things about how Bethesda envisioned their society and envisioned their usage in the games. For one, we know that in Skyrim they were supposed to nomadically trek around the province and hunt mammoths on the plains, leading to conflicts with the giants and the Centaurs. Which would have been quite cool, but the idea was apparently never implemented due to time constraints, and apparently not even a model for the Centaurs had been made, meaning that it was likely scrapped quite early in development. Now, we also know that in the Elder Scrolls Online they were supposed to appear, as data mines show us that several classes of Centaur NPCs exist in the data, without models or anything, so also scrapped quite early, but we do know that they have several classes in the game and there were supposed to be some missions concerning the Centaurs. From this cut content we can find one pretty interesting thing, and that is that their nomadic tribes are apparently, in the cut content at least, led by females of their species, as they have a specific leader matriarch class, which is pretty interesting. Also, one of their few still existing mentions in the game is for the dungeon Elden Hollow, which is supposed to be a Centaur graveyard in the lore, and still is in the final game. Although in cut content, their bones, which are said to have alchemical properties, were supposed to play a far bigger role in that dungeon story, which is interesting but is also cut content. Now, it's a bit of a shame that in the final game they never appeared. There's some suggestion that the Elder Scrolls Online developers might have forgot about the Centaurs, although they are present in the data mines, so I don't know. That's why I haven't really speculated on where they are in the second era, as they seem to be cut for time constraints. Alright, now let's talk about a creature family that was not cut for time constraints and is present in 2 of the games, even 3 if you count Skyrim's Creation Club, the family of the Nix. The Nix species consists of the Nix Hound and the Nix Ox, and to make things a bit more complicated, those are actually separate but distantly related species as well. Let's start by talking about the Nix Hound. Now, the Nix Hound is a 4-legged insectoid native to Morrowind's Ashlands, which is really where so far we found a lot of Tamriel's most interesting insects, as you probably noticed. Now, the Nix Hound is most often compared to Tamriel's wolves due to their comparable size and behavior. While these creatures primarily target small animals like baby guars and goats, they occasionally also hunt larger prey, including the intelligent races of Tamriel, making it necessary for travelers to watch out for them while traveling the Ashlands, and for Dunmer children not to be let out alone into the wilds, else they may be eaten by Nix Hounds. Now, generally Nix Hounds will organize themselves into packs, much like wolves that they resemble, though they are said to be a bit less intelligent than wolves and dogs. Despite this, their behavior is strikingly similar to dogs, especially in domesticated settings, because they can be domesticated and they are sometimes kept as pets by the Dunmer, as they can be easily domesticated and even show affection towards their owners. Nix Hounds can also be trained as trackers, using their keen sense of smell to find objects. Again, just like dogs. Something interesting is that the Nix Hound, while a predator, isn't really a meat eater. In fact, once they take down their prey, they generally just suck out the blood out of the prey's bodies, leaving behind husks of drained, clean meat, which in turn contributes to Morrowind's ecosystem by providing food for other creatures, which eat these bloodless carcasses. Their need for sustenance, however, is great, and when food is scarce, they may resort to preying upon each other or even feeding on fluid-rich plants, which is pretty interesting, as that means that they are sort of omnivores, as they can survive of both plant fluids and animal fluids. Now, like I said, they share their names with the Nix Ox, which, despite having the first name Nix as well, are wildly different creatures and are basically a different species which is just distantly related. The Nix Ox is a large 6-legged arthropod that looks a bit like a gigantic flea, and they're roughly the size of horses. They've got long hairy legs that allow these giants to roam the ashlands of Morrowind. Although it may appear intimidating, the Nix Ox is actually primarily a peaceful creature, feeding on fungus, especially large hardened mushrooms, which it cracks open with its mandibles to reach the softer interiors. They start out as larvae, and over the course of their lives they grow up to become gentle giants, as some Dark Elves call them. Now, the Nix oxen have been domesticated for centuries by the Ashlander tribes, who use them for various purposes, including using them as war mounts in some cases. There's several different variants of Nix oxen, each with unique traits. For example, the fire moth Nix ox, which has red-orangish legs, tends to be more aggressive, although they can still be tamed, and especially these aggressive ones are often used as war mounts by skilled riders. There's several different other variants as well, from variants with blue legs to grey legs. Capturing and domesticating wild Nix oxen is actually a very well established profession in Morrowind. Dedicated breeders raise domesticated herds, while hunting parties venture into the wilderness to capture wild ones. These hunters typically strike at dawn when the Nix oxen are still asleep, ensuring they're capturing the best specimens of the bunch. To domesticate a wild Nix oxen, handlers have to use drills to carefully pierce the creature's thick carapace to reach a specific bundle of nerves and organs, where trained professionals can insert hooks to make the creatures docile and obedient. There are some in Tamriel who take offense to this practice, seeing this as hard changing their nature and seeing this as quasi-slavery, but the Dunmer don't really see anything wrong with it, and they don't intend to stop in the foreseeable future. Now, despite being gentle creatures after their domestication, some wild Nix oxen can be quite aggressive. This behavior makes the profession of Nix ox taming actually quite dangerous now and then. Nonetheless, the demand for Nix oxen, whether for work or warfare, has created a thriving market in Morrowind, with breeders and hunters creating an entire industry based on the exploitation of the creatures. Which I think is pretty interesting. Now, next up, let's talk about everyone's favorite intelligent ape creatures, the Imga of Valenwood. So, the Imga, an obscure beast race that lives primarily in the jungles of Valenwood. They're intelligent ape men who live in both the treetops, in old elvish and human ruins across the province, and in the Bosmer cities in Valenwood's great Grad Oaks, where they live together with the Bosmer. They're said to have been Valenwood's original beast race that was there long before any elvish race set foot on Tamriel, so even before the Bosmer. They are described to look like a mix between large apes and a human with thick fur, being even taller than most high elves. This description has led to some people on Tamriel, especially people who live far away from Valenwood, to suggest that the Imga might not actually exist, but that the reports of them are instead just racist depictions of wood elves. However, that's not the case, as we have several first and second hand accounts of the Imga actually existing, including a few Bosmer who speak of having seen them or having lived with them, so we know that they do exist. Now, while the Imga have been described as an intelligent ape-man beast race with excellent hand-eye coordination and agility, we do know that their intelligence seems to be slightly lower than that of the playable races. While they do have a functioning society, that society seems to be very tribal in its structure, and they don't really claim any land to be theirs, instead they just live wherever they are. They don't build anything, they simply live in the trees and in the buildings that are left behind by other races. They also don't seem to be able to craft advanced weapons, only being able to craft simple tools, although they are able to use weaponry, because as we will get into, they will sometimes use weapons made by the other races. They're able to cook, but their dishes are said to be very simple. They make musical instruments, but those again are very simple ones like drums. So while definitely a step down in terms of advancement and intelligence compared to the other playable races, but they're definitely not just some race of animal, as some in the community seem to suggest. Now, in terms of interaction with the other races, we do know that they have some respect for the Bosmer, and they tend to live together with the Bosmer in several big Bosmer tree cities, where the Imga then live in the treetops and are part of the city's ecosystem. Some unlicensed, out-of-game texts of ex-developers that they wrote after leaving Bethesda suggest that some Bosmer don't really like the Imga, but that seems to be a bit contradictory to everything else that we know, so I don't put much faith in it. But it does mean that there is a possibility that in some places across Valenwood, the Imga and the Bosmer may be in conflict or just not that fond of one another. Now, one race that they definitely don't want conflict with is the High Elves. Some of the more humorous descriptions of the Imga say that they idolize High Elves to an almost absurd degree. It's said that they see the High Elves as the pinnacle of society and what they should strive to be. Therefore, many Imga are said to see High Elves as their superiors and treat them with extreme respect, and they try to imitate the High Elves in many ways, as they strive to be like them. For example, it's said that they wear capes in imitation of High Elves. They also try to copy High Elf speech patterns, which actually sounds kinda clumsy, and they try to practice with High Elf weapons. They also give each other ridiculous, extravagant titles, which don't really mean anything, as other than their chieftains, they don't really seem to have any formal societal structure. They also try to imitate the High Elves when it comes to their behavior, as they pretend to really hate humans and perfume the edges of their capes that they wear so that they can hold them to their nose when a human walks by in order not to smell them, as the Imga believe that humans have a putrid smell, probably due to hearing that from the High Elves, as usually Imga don't really have any contact with humans. Also, in very extreme circumstances where Imga try to imitate the High Elves, some are said to completely shave off their fur, then powder their skin to look more like High Elves. The description that we have says that they are too clumsy to do this properly though, and they then cut themselves in the process, creating a, and I quote from the source material here, pathetic picture of a shaved ape with skin dotted with bloody cuts. This is obviously pretty pathetic, but in the lore after the Elder Scrolls Redguard, where that depiction originates from, it's been suggested that far from all Imga do stuff like that, with most of them simply dwelling in the trees and in the ruins in Valenwood, just living their best life. It's not to say that not all Imga respect High Elf culture and strive to be like it, it's just that they don't all shave themselves and do that kind of thing. Because in the Elder Scrolls Online, the Imga were planned to appear, but cut pretty late in development. While we don't seem to have any character models data mined, so we don't really know what the Imga look like except for these two images, data miners did find that one of the quests would have been to go on a scavenger treasure hunt with an Imga tribe, where they tried to find some, likely High Elf, cutlery, which they apparently saw as a big treasure. That said, cut content also gives us an insight into the names of Imga, as they're pretty primitive, almost caveman-like. We know that 2 elders or chieftains were planned to be in the game, with one named Knunk and the other Brump, and then we have 3 other Imga names that I could find, being Fush, Hoom and Wood. Unfortunately, that content was cut, but even if it was there, the Imga would just likely have played a very small role, probably just appearing for a few quests. As the Elder Scrolls Online takes place in a time of great conflict, and the Imga are said to always hide themselves in the deepest part of the jungle when there's war, in order not to become collateral damage. They then probably re-emerge once again to once more live their best lives in the jungle when there's peace. However, there have been suggestions that the walking city of Falanesti, which is also absent from the Elder Scrolls Online, houses a pretty big Imga colony, and that city has been teased a couple of times for the Elder Scrolls Online, so perhaps, just maybe, we might see them in the next few years. In which case I'll make another video on them. By the way, if you're interested in that walking city that I just talked about, a video on the walking city of Falanesti is in the description of this video. Now, something interesting to note here is that while so far I, and basically any other lore video that I found online, portrayed them as some sort of illiterate cavemen who aren't at all that intelligent, that might not really be necessarily the case. Let me explain. We have 2 Imga in history who we know have been a lot smarter than most videos portray them to be, so perhaps their intelligence gap has just been exaggerated, or perhaps they're just as intelligent as the other races in terms of potential, but they just haven't been educated, as they just live in tribes. Let me explain. We have 2 Imga, one that we know could read and write, and the other was a very powerful necromancer. The Necromancer is an unnamed Imga who managed to become a Lich, which is an extremely complicated process only very accomplished necromancers can even hope to achieve, and this Imga then managed to temporarily become the tyrannical ruler of a small city before being defeated. And the second Imga that we know of to have been far more intelligent than the stereotype that we know is the Prophet Maruk, an Imga from the First Era who wrote down the Alessian doctrines after supposedly getting a vision of Saint Alessia. His writings were the original inspiration for the radical movement called the Alessian Order, which would go on to try and make Akatosh the one true divine. The radicals of the order named themselves after the Prophet Maruk, naming themselves the Marukati Selectives. Now, we don't know for how long the Prophet Maruk lived, but we do know that his writings would change the First Cyrillic Empire and Tamriel forever. I mean, as the person inspiring the Alessian Order, he is definitely in the top 50, if not top 30 or 20 of the most important people in Tamriel's history, considering what the Order would go on to do, which we'll cover in a future video on the Alessian Order. So, based on that, we cannot really say that all Imga are of low intelligence. Like I said, perhaps they're just extremely uneducated and they just enjoy a more carefree existence in the jungle, who knows. But to say that all Imga are of low intelligence would likely be very misleading considering some of the examples that we do have. Now, that being said, I truly do wonder if we will ever see Imga in any of the games. While in the lore for the Elder Scrolls Redguard, they were made to seem like basically another prominent beast race, for example with them being described in the same sentence as Argonian and Khajiit in some cases. They have been made far less prominent since Morrowind, with, according to some people, that being likely because Bethesda thought that they might have been a bit offensive as a creature. While I couldn't find a source for that, I kinda get where they're coming from considering some of the stuff that we talked about before in this video, but that's not to say that they've been retconned, because that they absolutely have not been, because in the last Elder Scrolls Online expansion, Gold Road, once again they have been referenced, and they have been consistently referenced in the other games and in the Elder Scrolls Online throughout the years, so they're still there, they just haven't been shown yet, so hey, perhaps one day. Alright, now let's talk about another type of insect, wasps. And you may think, why wasps? We have wasps in our own universe, right? Well, while yes, our universe has plenty of wasps, as anyone trying to eat anything outside in the summer can tell you, they aren't necessarily the size of a fully grown human. If they were, I would lock myself inside my apartment for the entirety of the summer. Fortunately, wasps that large only appear on Tamriel, and they are terrifying. They have 2 sets of wings, multifaceted eyes, and they have quite a hard carapace. They are highly territorial creatures, mostly living in Tamriel's jungles and swamps, and they can make immensely big nests to house their colonies in, which are led by a queen. They are quite deadly creatures to travelers and ordinary people, as they have a deadly sting, and will, when threatened, even use their own young in combat, as they carry their eggs with them, and they can force these eggs to hatch during combat in order to fight alongside the parent. Now, the giant wasp has an even more terrifying and bigger cousin on Tamriel called the Parapton, or at least that's the name given to them by unofficial material, as while they do appear in official sources, they're never named beyond being an even bigger kind of wasp. These wasps are the size of essentially large horses. They live in Morrowind's plains, mountains and ashlands, just like a lot of other large terrifying insects in this video, and House Dress of Morrowind has managed to tame some of these immensely big wasps and uses them as flying mounts. According to some unofficial material by an ex-writer, the Parapton colonies also have queens, and said queen is much bigger than the regular Paraptons, and the queen also determines, during an audience with the Dunmer of House Dress, whether or not one of her children will be sent out to become tamed and then used as a mount. However, that last bit again is unlicensed and unofficial material, so keep that in mind, but I do think it fits neatly into the lore that we already have, with House Dress using these massive wasps as flying mounts in official material. Now, additionally, we also got the so-called Kotu Gava, which aren't gigantic wasps, but rather are gigantic mosquitoes. There's very little lore on these creatures from what I can tell, other than that they exist, and that they have a very painful bite, and we know that the females of the species can become brood mothers, which can give birth to several smaller, younger Kotugava. Other than that, we don't know anything, unfortunately. And that is about all I can say about the different types of giant wasp. Now, next up is a type of moth. Now, while Tamriel has many different types of moth, this one particularly is very interesting. I'm talking, of course, about the Ancestor Moth. Now, by far the most well-known type of moth is the Ancestor Moth, which is also perhaps the most renowned and revered moth of the bunch. Native to Cyrodiil and specific microclimates around Tamriel known as Ancestor Glades, these sacred gypsy moth-like creatures are deeply intertwined with Cyrodiilic traditions. The cult of the Ancestor Moth, which I talked about before on this channel in my video about moth priests, venerates these moths, believing that they carry the spirits of ancestors, preserving their wisdom for future generations. And through specific sacred rituals with these moths, the order can attempt to read the Elder Scrolls, something which is otherwise nearly impossible for mortal eyes. The process of reading an Elder Scrolls with the help of Ancestor Moths is mystical, involving a phenomenon called the Song of the Ancestor Moth, which is slow, harmonious sound waves that allow the moths to serve as a sort of conduit through which the scrolls can be interpreted by mortals. It's pretty complicated, and I talk about it in a far greater extent in my video on moth priests. But this ability to help with interpreting what's essentially a fragment of creation definitely makes them one of the most interesting insects on this list in my opinion. Now, one additional thing that you need to know about Ancestor Moths is that the silk that they produce, which is known as Ancestor Silk, is highly prized across Cyrodiil and is valued by most nobles for creating really fine garments, and also valued for making strong light armor that also easily holds powerful enchantment. And that's about all I can say about the Ancestor Moths. Now, next up, we're not necessarily going to be talking about a creature, but if you'll allow me a little bit of leeway, you'll see that the topic is nonetheless very interesting and kind of borders the creature subject. If you don't think they're creatures, feel free to skip the subject, as I'll be talking about some vampiric flowers. So, in the year 433 of the Third Era, the year of the Oblivion Crisis and the time in which the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion takes place, A man named Amantius Electus lived in the Imperial city. We can meet him in Oblivion, and for all terms and purposes he seemed like a respectable man, a writer by trade. But if we dig a little deeper during the Thieves Guild quest May the Best Thief Win, you can find out that he actually has a much darker side to him. In his house we can find his diary, together with a table filled with flowers which is surrounded by blood. In my first 2 playthroughs of the game, I have to admit I never really read the diary, but a while back I read it for the first time and I found out what the deal was with this creepy setup in his basement. You see, if you read the diary, you can find out that Amantius Electus was trying to create undead plants infused with vampirism. In order to create his vampiric plants, which he would call drinkers, he created a special type of seed, a drinker seed. From his diary we learn that if you mix a plant seed with 2 parts of grave dust, 1 part of ash salts, and then mix those 3 ingredients with human blood, and then expose the drenched seed to 2 hours of moonlight, you get vampiric plant seeds. From the moment that he planted the seeds, he had to apply a very specific and precise schedule of nutrient solutions that he applied to the plants. Part of that solution was the blood of rats. After a while, the first shoots of the drinker plants appeared, and after which he was able to also start seeing fronds of the plants, and the plants slowly grew larger as he kept feeding them blood. After a while he started noticing that despite there being no wind in his basement, the vampiric plants waved about as if they were standing in a breeze. At this time he also ran out of rat blood and he started kidnapping local cats and dogs, which he needed for the blood that he had to feed to his vampire drinker plants. But at some point he got cut by one of his plants, after which he noticed that the drinkers refused to feed on the blood of animals anymore, and from that point on only seemed to want to feed on human and elven blood when he offered them some of it. Because at one point he had offered them some of his own blood and they drank that greedily, while the ones that he fed animal blood started to wither. He then secretly started buying human blood from the healers in the Imperial city, whom he had paid a lot of hush money to keep quiet so he could continue his experiment. But it wasn't long until the plants wanted so much blood that he started to doubt himself and doubted whether or not he had created something evil, as up until that point he believed that he was doing something good, something for the good of all the Empire. But perhaps the price was too high at that point and the plants were just evil. After some more deliberation, he then burned all of his notes on how to create the plants and set the trays of the plants on the roof of his house where the sunlight could touch them. After an hour of exposure to sunlight, the plants were dead and were withered. His experiment had been too dangerous and he decided to stop it before it was too late. But here's the thing though, what exactly was the purpose of his experiment? Amantius Electus states in his diary that he believed that he was doing something for the good of all of Cyrodiil. But how exactly? Because, you know, vampiric plants, what's good about that? Well, I've got a few theories for you. You see, I got the idea for this video when I saw a UESP tweet a couple of days ago, which reminded me of this quest. And in the comments of this tweet, there was the very discussion taking place on what the exact purpose of this experiment was. So credit where credit is due for the following 2 theories. First, we have the theory of the UESP Twitter admin, who suspects that Amantius wanted to plant these vampiric plants in the caves and abandoned ruins of Cyrodiil in order to prevent bandits and monsters from settling in the caves. It's an interesting theory, because you plant the plants in the cave, and because it's dark there, they can grow there, and they can sort of protect the caves against intruders like bandits and monsters, but they can't spread out of the cave, since once they set foot out of a cave or grow their offspring out of a cave, then they will die because of the sunlight. But it's an interesting theory, but in Amantius' notes we can read that the plants wither if they don't feed on blood for a long time. So I'm personally not that inclined to believe the theory, since the plants would die out at some point and then, you know, bandits can still just enter. But on the other hand, perhaps that was Amantius' goal and he just hadn't found a way yet to make them sustainable without too much blood. And that may have been the end goal, but I guess we'll never know. Now, a second interesting theory I saw on Twitter was by a user named Prime Directive. His theory was that Amantius maybe wanted to create a consumable crops which needed blood instead of water and sunlight, so that farms could more easily be cultivated in less accessible places, such as caves or maybe during very harsh winters. It's an interesting theory, and it's close to my own theory. because I personally think that he may have wanted to try and find a way to make immortal plants which could be harvested for crops for years and years and years without the plant dying. But then again, Amantius' research was too short to actually find out whether the fruits of his drinker plants would be edible or not for mortals, or whether undead plants would even be able to carry fruits or not, because the experiment was quite short in his lifetime, but perhaps that was the goal. Anyway, what the exact goal of the experiment is, we don't know. These are all theories, and please let me know your own theories down below, because I'm actually very interested to learn what other people think about this experiment. Some people online have suggested that Amantius may just have been off his rocker and he just didn't make any sense in his thoughts, but then even he must have had some goal in mind which was for the good of all of Cyrodiil, so I wonder what he might have thought and what the exact good in his head was for these plants. But yeah. What's interesting about this whole ordeal is that apparently vampirism can spread to all living things, not just elves and humans. We already kind of knew this because of death hounds that we can see in Dawnguard, and the fact that Argonians, who share no blood or genes with elves or humans, can also become vampires. But to know that even plants can become vampiric is really, really interesting. Imagine if, for example, a whole jungle like the ones in Elsewhere or Valenwood got infected. Quite interesting to think about, but since the vampiric plants seem to die in the sunlight, it's not really a realistic scenario which would ever come through, I think, but still interesting to think about. Because if all living things could be infected with vampirism, we can also see, for example, I don't know, vampiric ladybugs or vampire fish, or even vampiric cliff racers, which is a thought probably too terrifying for mortals. And that concludes the story of the vampiric flowers. Now next up we'll talk about several large types of beetle on Tamriel that each have some very interesting lore to them. Starting with the shroom beetle. The smallest of these beetles I'll talk about. The shroom beetle, or shroom stalk. Now, I say small, but really, these things are the size of your average real-life dog, but they are pretty harmless creatures in the shape of a beetle, with mushrooms on its back living both in the wilds and as pets all over eastern and northeastern Tamriel, from Skyrim's caverns to Morrowind's ashlands and Blackmarsh's swamps. They are quite abundant in Morrowind, where the local Dunmer often keep them as pets. But the funny thing is that it's been suggested that the creature originally was just native to Blackmarsh, but that the Dunmer took many of them with them to Morrowind to be kept as pets. They then took these creatures from the swamps of Blackmarsh during their raids in which they capture Argonian slaves, with some sources suggesting that these captured shroom beetles eventually blossomed into one big Morrowind-wide population after some released them into the wilds in Morrowind, with some of them making their way all the way to the caves of Skyrim through the underground tunnels between Skyrim and Morrowind. There are quite a few different variants of shroom beetle to be found across Tamriel, with by far the most common one being the red ruby cap shroom beetle, but a blue cap and gold cap shroom beetle also existing, with especially the gold cap being a popular pet with the rich. Now, my personal favorite variant of these is the luminescent shroom beetle, a shroom beetle with light emitting mushrooms on its back found in deep caverns. And another personal favorite is the blue cap shroom beetle, which apparently releases relaxing spores inside your house, so it's just kind of a drug pet, which is kind of funny. Alright, next up let's talk about the thunderbug. The thunderbug is another large type of beetle, even larger than the shroom beetle, being 2 or 3 times their size. They are specifically known for their bright yellow carapaces and unique connection to electric elemental energy. Thunderbugs possess powerful electric abilities that they use for both defense of their eggs and their nests, and offense against their prey. Interestingly, thunderbugs often gather in packs feeding off each other's elemental energy to kind of recharge and strengthen themselves, and their connection to electricity also enables them to perform various elemental attacks on their prey, which makes them even more dangerous in groups. Their life cycle is largely unknown, but it's known that they start out laying eggs in places with a soft surface, after which from the eggs, young thunderbugs hatch as maggots, which then grow into adult thunderbugs. Now, their name is derived from their sharp bite, which shocks a person with a jolt of electricity whenever they attack someone. In addition, thunderbugs have some surprising uses. Their eggs, for example, are said to taste rather sweet, and eating them creates a tingling sensation due to a small amount of electricity that's within the egg. Additionally, like many other bugs that we've talked about in this video so far, parts of their bodies are sometimes harvested and used in crafting and consumption. For example, their youngest maggot form is often harvested by the Bosmer in the making of their disgusting Rothmet alcoholic beverage. Cool, I guess. Now, the next creature that we'll talk about is another large beetle, the Shulk. The Shulk lacks the Thunderbug's electrical powers. Instead, Shulks are known for their ability to spit fire, making them quite dangerous in their own right. They are native to the ashlands of Morrowind, specifically close to those places where the lava is closest to the surface and temperature is warmest. They tend to congregate together near lava flows, gathering in packs, although they can also be found deep underground in Morrowind's caverns. Various versions of the Shulk exist, ranging in size and color. Some are smaller, while others, particularly those seen in the Elder Scrolls Online, are much larger. The different variants mostly set themselves apart by having different patterns on their carapaces, such as the orange and yellow variant, which is most seen on the surface of Vardenfell, and the ash-grey colored Ash-Eater beetle, which is a version of Shulk which buries itself in ash-covered surfaces. And then there's the black-shelled fiery Shulk, which we see in the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. Now, Shulks are a pretty sizable cog in Morrowind's ecosystem and economy, as they are herded for their meat, with their carapaces used in crafting and their resin harvests to make glue. Just like many others, their body parts have a diverse range of applications that the people of Morrowind use, from furniture making to medicine production to, like I said, glue. Now, the final type of gigantic beetle that we're going to talk about is the so-called assassin beetle. The assassin beetle, which again is similar in size to both the thunderbugs and the shulks, is another hostile large beetle. However, this large black and red beetle was originally from Yokuda. These beetles evolved from the smaller Samara beetles of Yokuda, which were once kept as pets by the Ragada and taken to Tamriel during their invasions. However, upon being brought to Tamriel, they found the environment so suitable that they eventually grew significantly larger and more dangerous, eventually outgrowing their pet status and becoming one of Hammerfell's natural predators, as they became too big to keep as pets and were released into the wilds by the early Redguards. In the wild, they developed aggressive tendencies, and their aggressive behavior makes them a threat to other creatures, forming a danger to both animals and mortal travelers. Now, the growing of the Samara beetles into the assassin beetles has some religious connotations, with some Redguards believing it is a hard lesson from the gods and not to fall for the hunger of sap or to greed. But how true that is, we don't know. Now, in general, assassin beetles are known for their stealthy nature, that's why they're called assassin beetles, because they often cloak themselves in shadows, becoming nearly invisible, and then strike their prey from behind, like an assassin. Now, while they mostly live in the deserts and savannas of Hammerfell, they have also migrated into jungles and other warm climates around Tamriel, as they adapted to a variety of environments and spread out across the continent. Alright, next up we've got our final bug of the video, or rather family of bugs, the Torchbug, and all other creatures within the Torchbug family, or that seem to be vaguely related. Now, the Torchbug are very small, glowing nocturnal beetles, very reminiscent of fireflies from our own universe. They live all across Tamriel near plants and flowers, and across Tamriel you've got many different variants and subspecies. And they also have cultural significances to many cultures around Tamriel. For example, the red crimson torchbug, which is commonly found in southern Tamriel, is believed to bless moon sugar production in Elsewhere, while the Bosmer believe that the regular yellow torchbug brings good fortune. Meanwhile, the purple torchbug is believed to be associated with Sheogorath's influence in a place. It's likely that we get even more Torchbug variants in the future, but we already have some very interesting subspecies for the creature nonetheless. For example, we've got the so-called Reeker, which is said to be a bug similar to the Torchbug, except instead of emitting light, it emits an absolutely foul stench, earning it the name Reeker. Now, we also got the Blissbug, which are Torchbug-like creatures from the Shivering Isles, but they still count for this video, as they often appear in places on Tamriel where Sheogorath's influence is strong, much like the purple torchbug is believed to be by the people of Tamriel. Now, we've also got the Dewbug, which looks and almost acts exactly the same way as regular torchbugs, except they have some very interesting magical properties. Because the Bosmer can use Dewbugs to create elemental lurcher guardians, which can be used to protect their homes. Their natural behavior is much like torchbugs, but that magical elemental property sets them apart, as far as we know, the regular torchbugs don't have the ability to be transformed into elemental nurture guardians. And that is about all I can say about the different types of torchbug. Now, finally for this video, I would like to take a look at a group of very interesting creatures, specifically the mythical creatures of Tamriel. Creatures that are so wondrous or strange, and are often extinct by now, killed by the early elves that landed on Tamriel after their exodus from their homelands. So whether or not these creatures are simply elvish legends or actually existed, we don't know, but they are still very interesting, so let's talk about them. So, a little history for you. In the middle of the Meretic era, the Aldmer, that's the Aldmer with a D instead of a T. They are the progenitor race to all elves that we can find on Tamriel. They fled their homeland of Old Muris due to it being endangered by some mysterious impending doom. Now, the first place they landed on were the Somerset Isles, although it wouldn't take long before they would also hop over onto Valenwood and colonize it. However, these lands that they landed on weren't exactly empty. In fact, they were inhabited by a range of creatures, many of whom were large, dangerous, and not very welcoming to these elves landing on their shores. But the elves didn't really care about the fact that all these creatures didn't want them on their lands, because the elves under their first Tamrielic leader, High Lord Torianon, swore to make the land theirs, which practically meant killing off all those creatures which threatened them. A few such of those creatures which they encountered, like the griffins, ended up surviving until the current day and either get tamed or remain in the wilds in small populations. But not all creatures that the Altmer encountered were as lucky as the griffin to escape extinction, as the Altmer drove many of the creatures that they encountered to extinction by killing all of them and presumably preventing their procreation in order to make the Somerset Isles livable for themselves, and they then tried the same in Valenwood. Now, when it comes to the Somerset Isles, there are three main legendary and mythical creatures which were driven to extinction. Basically, we've got the Gaetus, the Iliadi, and the Welwa. Now, the Welwa is a particularly interesting case because while they were originally driven to extinction in the Somerset Isles by the Altmer, they were later introduced back into the Somerset ecosystem after some Altmer found an alive population of Welwas in Hammerfell. You see, the Welwa are these strange four-eyed beasts. They seem a bit like large rats to me, but they're almost bigger than horses, and they have a very bad temperament. They hunt in packs, and with their sharp teeth and quick movement, they make for a real threat to most mortals. Now, the Altmer, which landed on the Somerset Isles in the Moretic era, found the creatures to be hostile and fearsome, seeing them as an existential threat, and thus quickly set themselves to eradicating the entire Somerset population of Welwas. Now, according to Altmer texts from at the time of those hunts, the Welwas were among the creatures least welcoming to the High Elves, and they likely raided the Altmer towns in their packs, as the Altmer from time to time wrote down that the Welwas sought the Altmer's demise, although that could have of course been just justification after the fact, after they basically killed them all off. But of those creatures which in ancient times were seen as the most dangerous, it's actually the only one to have survived. And not because the Altmer didn't try to wipe all the Welwas out, because they did. But as I said before, some wild Welwas were actually found in Hammerfell, where they were actually being domesticated by the local orcs, who even used them as war beasts. Now, from there, 6 breeding pairs were taken by the Altmer Sapiarchs, who reintroduced them into the Somerset ecosystem thousands of years after they had originally gone extinct due to the Altmer hunts. So, yeah, maybe you feel like this one didn't really count since it's not extinct, but the other 2 primary ancient enemies of the Altmer on the Somerset Isles are definitely all dead by now. Although, interestingly, those 2 species, the Gaetus and the Iliadi, are both on the to-do list of the same guy who brought the Welwas back, but he hasn't found any survived herds of those, so yeah, it's probably not gonna happen. But still, they are quite interesting, so let's talk about them. Let's start with the Iliadi, which is a type of forest spirit or even fairy, according to some theories online. Like the Welwas, the Iliadi were creatures with more than just 2 eyes, as they were forest giants whose entire heads were covered by their eyes. Now, these creatures were apparently also aggressive to the Altmer, being named in classic Altmer ballads as working with the Welwas to try and achieve the Altmer's demise and drive them from the Isles. But unfortunately for the Iliadi, just like with the Welwas, they were no match for the early Altmer, who brought ancient magic from their ancient homeland of Altmuris, which was used to exterminate them in just a few years. Now, the final ancient enemy of the Altmer in the trinity of the most dangerous creatures that they found and exterminated were the Gaetus. Now, these Gaetus are a bit of a mystery, because I don't really understand how they lost to the Altmer ancient magic. I mean, it's not too clear to me. You see, while the Welwa were beasts and the Iliadi were many-eyed tree giants, speculated to be a type of fairy, so they definitely had some magical properties, the Gaetus is just straight up described as a godlike fairy being with, according to legend, godlike powers. And because of that, I personally kinda doubt that they even existed in the way that they are described, or were just adapted into Altmer legend in a more grand way to make their victory over these creatures seem more epic. But yeah, we don't really know. What we do know is that on ancient Altmer tapestries, the Gaetus are described as a type of godlike fairy, which takes the shape of a single man or multiple men, which are created from the earth itself. This man or group of men is then surrounded by minor fairies, which all do its bidding. Now, considering these creatures are extinct, I wouldn't really be surprised if the Gatus was just one of these Earthmen, and the rest of these Earthmen were just minor spirits, hence why in some cases they are described as one, and in some cases they are described as a group of men, which forms the one creature. But we just know very, very little about them, unfortunately, so that part is also just speculation. Now, with the Iliadi being the speculated forest spirit fairies and the Gatus more or less confirmed to be a type of fairy, I made a video on fairies and fairy types in general in the Elder Scrolls lore. It's in the description if you want to learn more about fairies. But those three, the Welwas, the Iliadi and the Gatus, were all driven to extinction on the Somerset Isles by the early Altmer in their quest to make the Isles theirs. Now, some of the most ancient tapestries in the Crystal Tower show the Altmer battles against these three type of creatures, which apparently work together sometimes to bring the Altmer to their knees. Now, these battles are very glorified in tapestries and no doubt exaggerated a bit, but there has to be some truth to them. But when it comes to the Iliadi and the Gatus, we don't really know what's real and what's exaggeration, since they have both been extinct on Tamriel for thousands of years. But before we move on to the extinct creatures of Valenwood, I have to say that there were two other creatures which the Altmer either drove off the Somerset Isles and still live nowadays, or drove to extinction. Now, the other creature that they made extinct was actually a bit smaller of stature. It's a bee, or a bee type, the Isgareth bee. Now, this type of bee used to be quite common in the Somerset Isles, but due to the belief that their honey grants immortality, which was really just a legend, it seems that their hives were all destroyed by greedy Altmer, until by the First Era, all of them were extinct. Now, some conspiracy theorists on Tamriel believe that some royalty still have these bees in their private gardens, but we don't have any proof for that. That being said, the legendary three enemies of the Altmer who they drove to extinction weren't the only creatures that they encountered on the Somerset Isles which were not very happy with their arrival. They are just the three which went extinct that we know about, and of course the bees. We know, like I said, that the Griffins, for example, also weren't very happy with the Altmer, and neither were the Sload, who actually lived on the Somerset Isles before the Altmer came to them. Now, the Sload, which are actually intelligent beings, actually had a pretty cool civilization going on the Somerset Isles, but the Altmer weren't too keen on sharing their land, and knowing the Sload, they were also not very happy with strangers on their shores, so after some skirmishes, the Sload were all driven off the Isles towards their now Kingdom of Thras. Now, I made videos on both Griffins and the Sload, and I highly recommend checking them out if you want to know more about either of them. They're in the description of the video if you want to know more. Alright, let's now talk about Valenwood. Now, just like on the Somerset Isles, the Altmer, when they landed in Valenwood, immediately started blasting. While the jungles proved harder to exterminate species in, as many of their ancient predators still lived, they did manage to get rid of a few. Most notably the Basilisk, a creature that we see in many types of fantasy, but which also exists in the Elder Scrolls lore, but it's just extinct due to the doing of the elves. Now, the portrayal of basilisks, from what we know, is pretty conventional in the Elder Scrolls universe, because it's a snake with magical powers and whose body parts have magical properties, and likely, just like in any other type of fantasy, looking them in the eyes would have caused for paralysis in the person who looked the basilisk in the eyes. But that's just honestly speculation, as their eyes cooked up in a potion can be used to cure paralysis, so I'd say it's likely that, their eyes have something to do with paralysis, so most likely looking them in the eyes would have had the inverse effect and paralyze you, especially since that's a whole thing with basilisks in other types of media. That said, basilisk body parts, while rare, extremely rare even since they've been extinct for so long, are still sometimes seen on the black market and in private collections of alchemists and other craftsmen, because their eyes are very potent alchemist ingredients and their blood can temper weapons, and powdered body parts can actually give a poisonous explosion. So while the creatures extinct, their body parts which survived from the time when they were still alive are still somewhat in circulation on Tamriel, although they are very, very rare and fetch a really good price. That being said, of most of the creatures which the elves drew to extinction in Valenwood, we know relatively little other than their names. For example, we know of Odowax, which we don't know anything of other than that they are now extinct in Valenwood and that they had really big fangs. Now, we also know that in Valenwood there used to live hippogriffs, who were likely related to the griffins in some way, but they were driven to extinction. Hydra existed, which were multi-headed dragon-like creatures, also driven to extinction. Forest giants, likely related to the Iliadi, existed, also driven to extinction. And satyrs existed, which we know nothing of. We don't even know what type of creature they were, only the name from the Pocket Guide to the Empire. And that they were, you may guess, driven to extinction by the early Altmer who landed in Valenwood. But considering that in other types of fantasy, these satyrs are essentially fawns or man beasts who are part goat, part man, I think that's most likely the type of creature that they were before being driven to extinction. Although in the Elder Scrolls Online High Isle expansion we actually have some fawns, so maybe those are the creatures that they meant by the name satyr, and they too may be reintroduced eventually, just like the well was in the Somerset Isles, if someone takes them from High Isle to Valenwood, but there's no real lore on that, or any efforts going on to do that. Now, a common trend in these types of creatures is that they are essentially classical fantasy creatures, the kind we don't really see a whole lot of in the Elder Scrolls universe. As usually, they either have a funny twist, like the unicorn being a Daedric minion in the Elder Scrolls universe, or they are completely original creatures, while stuff like hippogriffs, hydras, they don't really seem very Elder Scrolls, so I'm not really surprised that they simply wrote them to be extinct creatures by this point. However, that does lead me to the curious case of the Balrog. You know, that guy who in the Lord of the Rings took Gandalf with him to the depths, and of which Morgoth had a whole army? Yeah, those creatures. They also existed in the Elder Scrolls universe. Specifically, they existed in the Elder Scrolls Arenas lore, as Balrog hide was actually an item. Although we have this image of a pre-release Elder Scrolls Arena monster, which was cut from the final release on the UESP, they speculate that it may have been a Balrog, but I'm not too sure personally. But, you know, whichever you want to believe. Now, since then, the Balrogs haven't been mentioned in the lore, so they are likely just retconned. But since some sources describe Somerset Isles to be overrun with demonic creatures before the Altmer cleaned house, my headcanon will be that they likely lived there, on the Somerset Isles, and were driven to extinction by the Altmer, and that just like with the Basilisk, their body parts are still sometimes found on the black market. But that's just my theory, but I like it. And I don't really see myself ever mentioning that Balrog trivia anywhere else anytime soon, so why not here, right? And that is about all I can say about the mythical creatures. Now, that concludes this long lore collection. If you ended up watching this entire video all the way to the end, let me know in the comments by commenting your favorite type of lunch. Not only will it confuse the hell out of people who did not watch all the way until the end, it might also give me some alternatives to plain toast. Anyway, I do sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video and that I managed to teach you something new about the Elder Scrolls universe today. And if I did, why not give the video a like to let the mighty YouTube algorithm know that you enjoyed this video. Let's work on my next video, probably launching next weekend. See you there. Bye bye.